When Japan began releasing treated nuclear wastewater from the Fukushima Daiichi power plant into the Pacific Ocean in August of last year, the decision triggered immediate and far-reaching consequences that continue to reverberate across global markets today. Within days of that first discharge, Beijing made a decisive move that would fundamentally alter the landscape of Japan's fishing industry, a comprehensive ban on all Japanese seafood imports. This wasn't merely a political gesture. It was an economic earthquake that would expose deep vulnerabilities in Japan's maritime economy and raise profound questions about food safety, international trust, and the true cost of nuclear disaster recovery. To understand the magnitude of this decision, consider this striking reality. Before the ban, nearly one-third of all Japanese seafood exports found their way to Chinese markets. From premium scallops harvested in Hokkaido to delicate varieties of fish caught off Japan's extensive coastline, China represented not just a customer, but the lifeline of Japan's aquaculture sector. The relationship between Japanese fishermen and Chinese consumers had been built over decades, creating supply chains, business relationships, and economic dependencies that seemed unshakable, until they weren't. The domino effect. When one ban becomes many. China's announcement didn't happen in isolation. Like dominoes falling across the Pacific, other nations began reassessing their relationship with Japanese seafood. Some countries implemented outright bans similar to China's approach. Others, perhaps more cautiously, introduced enhanced testing protocols and elevated safety standards that effectively slowed Japanese imports to a trickle. The numbers tell a sobering story. Over the 12 months following China's ban, Japan's marine food exports collapsed by 47%. To put that in perspective, we're talking about economic losses exceeding $13 billion, money that once supported coastal communities, fishing families, and an entire ecosystem of businesses built around Japan's relationship with the sea. For a nation where fishing isn't just an industry but a cultural heritage stretching back millennia, this represents more than economic hardship. It's an existential crisis for entire communities. Walk through the fishing ports of northeastern Japan today, and you'll witness the human cost of these statistics. Boats that once left harbor before dawn now sit idle. Processing facilities that hummed with activity operate at a fraction of their capacity. Fishermen who inherited their trade from their fathers and grandfathers now face an impossible question. How long can they hold on? These workers, their livelihoods crumbling beneath them, have turned their anger and desperation toward their own government. Through protests, petitions, and increasingly vocal public campaigns, they're demanding one thing above all else: that Tokyo find a way to restore trade relations with Beijing and reopen access to the Chinese market that sustained them for so long. To grasp why China and other nations responded so forcefully, we need to examine what's actually in the water being released from Fukushima. Nuclear-contaminated water isn't simply dirty water that can be cleaned with conventional filtration. It contains multiple radioactive isotopes, with tritium and cesium-137 being among the most concerning. These substances don't behave like ordinary pollutants. They're insidious in their persistence, and honestly, kind of frightening in their biological effects. Here's how the risk compounds. Radioactive materials don't just disperse harmlessly into the ocean's vastness. Instead, they enter the marine food web at the microscopic level. Plankton absorb these particles. Small fish eat the plankton. Larger fish consume the smaller ones. With each step up this biological ladder, the concentration of radioactive substances intensifies, a process scientists call bioaccumulation. By the time a tuna or salmon reaches a dinner plate, it may carry radioactive loads far exceeding what was initially released into the water. The health implications are genuinely alarming. Tritium, one of the primary isotopes in Fukushima's wastewater, possesses a particular quality that makes it especially dangerous. It's readily absorbed by the human body. Once inside, it can integrate into cellular structures, becoming part of the very molecules that make up our tissues. When tritium decays, and radioactive decay is inevitable, it releases energy that damages DNA at the molecular level. This DNA damage doesn't announce itself with immediate symptoms. Instead, it plants seeds that may germinate years or even decades later as cancer. Thyroid cancer and leukemia are particularly associated with radiation exposure, but the list of potential health effects extends much further. Reproductive systems can be compromised. Immune function may be weakened. The cascade of biological harm is extensive and often irreversible. Given these scientific realities, China's position becomes clearer. This isn't about politics alone. It's about public health, consumer protection, and the fundamental responsibility of government to safeguard its citizens from preventable harm. Faced with the loss of their largest customer, Japanese trade officials pivoted desperately toward other potential markets. The United States, the European Union, and South Korea all became targets of intensive diplomatic and commercial efforts. The American response proved particularly instructive. Washington didn't slam the door completely, but neither did it throw it open. Instead, U.S. regulators implemented stricter import standards, permitting only select categories of Japanese seafood to enter American markets. Scallops, notably, made the approved list. In a gesture that seemed designed more for diplomatic optics than commercial logic, American imports of Japanese scallops actually increased to the point where the United States overtook China as the top destination for this particular product. On paper, this looked like success. Japanese officials could point to growing American demand as evidence that international markets still had confidence in their seafood. But look beyond the headlines, and the picture darkens considerably. Despite America's increased scallop purchases, Japan's overall scallop exports still plummeted by 37% over a 6-month period. The mathematics are unforgiving. The American market, even with its increased appetite, simply cannot absorb the volume that China once consumed. It's like trying to fill a swimming pool with a garden hose after losing access to a fire hydrant. South Korea presented another potential lifeline, and Japanese exporters pushed aggressively into this market. Seoul hasn't imposed a total ban on Japanese seafood from most regions, but the pathway to Korean dinner tables is narrow and treacherous. Every shipment faces rigorous testing for radioactive contamination. The thresholds are strict. Trace amounts that might be dismissed as negligible elsewhere can trigger rejection in South Korea. Even when products pass initial screening, Korean authorities often demand additional certification and documentation before allowing them to proceed. This bureaucratic gauntlet adds time, cost, and uncertainty to every transaction. For Japanese exporters already operating on thin margins, these obstacles can make the difference between viability and bankruptcy. The European Union, despite its geographic distance from the Pacific, has also tightened its stance. European food safety standards were already among the world's most stringent, and the Fukushima situation prompted Brussels to raise the bar even higher. Japanese seafood now faces an almost insurmountable wall of regulatory requirements to enter EU markets. The message from these major economic powers is consistent and clear. Even Japan's closest allies are not willing to give its seafood industry the benefit of the doubt. Japanese authorities haven't been passive in the face of this crisis. They've pointed repeatedly to technological solutions implemented at Fukushima, particularly the Advanced Liquid Processing System, known by its acronym ALPS. ALPS represents a significant engineering achievement. This sophisticated multi-stage filtration system is designed to remove or reduce dozens of different radioactive isotopes from contaminated water. Japanese officials and TEPCO, the power company operating Fukushima, have invested billions of yen into this technology and the infrastructure surrounding it. On paper, ALPS should address many of the concerns about radioactive contamination. The system can successfully reduce concentrations of numerous dangerous isotopes to levels that, according to Japanese calculations, fall within internationally recognized safety parameters. But here's the problem that skeptics worldwide have identified. ALPS cannot remove everything. Tritium, in particular, poses an intractable challenge. The chemical properties that make tritium so easily absorbed by living organisms also make it extraordinarily difficult to filter from water. Unlike cesium or strontium, which can be captured through various chemical and physical processes, tritium is an isotope of hydrogen itself. It forms part of the water molecule. H2O becomes HTO when tritium substitutes for regular hydrogen. Separating tritium from water is like trying to separate identical twins at the molecular level. Japanese officials have been forthright about this limitation. Their argument essentially comes down to this: while tritium remains in the treated water, its concentration has been diluted to levels they consider safe, and ocean dispersion will dilute it even further. But critics point out a crucial gap in this reassurance. Independent verification is severely limited. Japan has relied heavily on assessments from the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, to validate its safety claims. The IAEA has indeed provided endorsements, with the organization's Director General personally visiting Fukushima to review operations and subsequently issuing reports broadly supportive of Japan's approach. Yet the IAEA operates within a complex web of international politics and institutional incentives. As an intergovernmental organization, it faces pressures and influences that can compromise the perception and potentially the reality of its independence. China and numerous other countries have explicitly questioned whether IAEA assessments can truly be considered impartial given these dynamics. More damning from a transparency standpoint, Tokyo has consistently refused to allow independent third-party testing teams unfettered access to Fukushima's waters and seafood. This reluctance to permit outside verification fuels suspicion. If the situation is truly as safe as Japan claims, critics ask, why the resistance to independent confirmation? Testing conducted by American environmental organizations has yielded troubling results. These independent researchers found radioactive contamination levels in seawater and marine life near Fukushima that significantly exceeded recognized safety standards. Similar findings have emerged from research institutions in Europe. These aren't fringe activists making wild accusations. These are credible scientific organizations using standard testing methodologies, and their findings contradict the official Japanese narrative. Recognizing that data alone wasn't swaying international opinion, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida attempted a different approach: personal demonstration. On August 23rd, precisely 1 year after the initial wastewater release began, Kishida traveled to Fukushima Prefecture. With cameras rolling and media representatives documenting every moment, he sat down to a meal featuring local seafood. He ate with apparent relish, smiling for the cameras, speaking with fishermen, and delivering a clear message. If the seafood is safe enough for Japan's prime minister, it's safe enough for anyone. Similar photo opportunities have occurred multiple times, with various government officials making the pilgrimage to Fukushima to publicly consume local fish and shellfish. As public relations strategy, there's a certain logic to this approach. Seeing political leaders literally eating the product they're defending should, in theory, provide powerful reassurance to skeptical consumers worldwide. But the Gambit has largely failed to move the needle. Why? Because the performance, however sincere, doesn't address the fundamental questions that concern critics. There's no way for observers to independently verify that the seafood consumed at these staged events actually originated from the waters where contamination risks are highest. Did the scallops on the Prime Minister's plate come from areas directly affected by wastewater discharge, or were they sourced from distant, unaffected waters? Moreover, a single meal, or even several, doesn't prove long-term safety. The health risks from radiation exposure are cumulative and often take years or decades to manifest. Eating contaminated seafood once might pose minimal risk. Eating it regularly over months and years is an entirely different proposition. Beijing's response to these theatrical gestures has been unambiguous, unmoved. Chinese officials have made clear that photogenic fish dinners are not a substitute for rigorous, independent scientific verification and fundamental changes to Japan's wastewater discharge policies. As months passed and economic losses mounted, Tokyo's approach evolved from technical explanations and public demonstrations toward more overt diplomatic pressure. Starting in July of this year, Japanese officials began making regular trips to Beijing. Ostensibly, these missions focused on broader bilateral relations, trade agreements, cultural exchanges, regional security cooperation. But, informed observers recognize that beneath the diplomatic niceties, these conversations consistently circled back to one central issue: the seafood ban. In the lead-up to the one-year anniversary of the initial wastewater release, Prime Minister Kishida publicly called upon China to lift its restrictions. He framed this as a matter of scientific evidence and economic fairness, arguing that Japan had fulfilled its international obligations and that continuing the ban served no legitimate purpose. Behind closed doors, Japanese diplomats reportedly went further, suggesting that if the ban continued, Tokyo might be compelled to implement retaliatory economic measures targeting Chinese interests. The implicit threat was clear. China might win this particular battle, but Japan could make the victory costly across other dimensions of the bilateral relationship. This pressure campaign reveals Tokyo's deepening desperation. Japanese policymakers recognize that time is not on their side. The longer the ban continues, the more permanent the damage becomes. Chinese consumers are developing new habits, forging new supply relationships, and potentially developing lasting skepticism about Japanese seafood that might persist even if official bans were eventually lifted. But there's a fundamental miscalculation in Japan's strategy. China holds considerably stronger economic cards in this contest than Japan seems willing to acknowledge. A clear-eyed assessment of Sino-Japanese economic relations reveals a striking imbalance. While Japan has certainly lost an important export market, China has successfully demonstrated something more significant. It doesn't actually need Japanese seafood. Consider what has happened over the past year. Has China faced seafood shortages? Have Chinese consumers been forced to dramatically alter their diets or pay prohibitive prices for alternative sources of fish and shellfish? The answer to both questions is definitively no. Instead, Chinese importers have simply redirected their purchasing toward other suppliers. Indonesia has emerged as a major beneficiary, with its seafood exports to China surging by 42%. Argentina, despite being located literally on the opposite side of the planet from China, has seen its seafood shipments to Chinese ports increase by a staggering 200%. These aren't temporary stopgaps. These are new trade relationships, with their own momentum and stakeholder interests. Indonesian fishing companies are investing in expanded capacity specifically to serve Chinese demand. Argentine exporters are building logistics networks and regulatory expertise that will persist regardless of what happens with Japan. Meanwhile, China has simultaneously accelerated development of its domestic aquaculture industry. Government policies actively encourage expansion of fish farming operations, modernization of production techniques, and investment in quality control systems. The goal is clear: reduce dependence on any single foreign supplier and enhance food security through domestic production. From Beijing's perspective, this is about strategic autonomy as much as public health. Why rely on imported seafood of questionable safety when alternatives exist? In contrast, numerous sectors of the Japanese economy remain deeply dependent on Chinese consumers, Chinese supply chains, and Chinese investment. From automotive components to electronic goods, from rare earth elements to industrial machinery, the ties binding Japanese prosperity to Chinese markets run far deeper than any single product category. This fundamental asymmetry means that any economic confrontation would hurt Japan considerably more than it would hurt China. Tokyo's implicit threats of retaliation ring hollow when the balance of economic power is properly understood. Here's what makes this entire situation particularly frustrating for many observers. Releasing treated nuclear wastewater into the ocean wasn't the only option available to Japan. In fact, it wasn't even clearly the best option. Alternative approaches existed. They were studied, evaluated, and discussed before being ultimately rejected. One technically viable alternative involved construction of deep underground storage systems. The concept is straightforward in principle. Build specialized containment facilities buried more than 1,000 meters below the surface. At those depths, geological formations provide natural barriers that could isolate contaminated water from surface ecosystems essentially indefinitely. The technology for such deep geological storage already exists. It's been successfully implemented for various types of hazardous waste in multiple countries. The physics and engineering are well understood. Yes, constructing such facilities would require enormous investment, billions of dollars in infrastructure, years of engineering work, and significant ongoing maintenance. But given that the Fukushima cleanup operation is already projected to cost hundreds of billions of dollars over decades, the incremental expense of proper wastewater containment seems almost trivial in comparison. More importantly, deep underground storage would have avoided the international controversy entirely. There would be no contaminated water entering the ocean, no bioaccumulation in the marine food chain, no trade bans, and no diplomatic crisis with China and other nations. Another alternative that received serious consideration involved solidification through cement-based encapsulation. This approach would mix the treated wastewater with special cement formulations that chemically bind with radioactive isotopes, creating solid blocks that can be safely stored on land. Japanese nuclear experts who advocated for this method argued that it offered advantages in terms of monitoring, verification, and future flexibility. Solid waste is easier to track and inspect than water dispersed into the ocean. If future technologies emerge that can more effectively process or neutralize the radioactive materials, solidified waste could potentially be retrieved and reprocessed. The cement approach would also have provided much clearer reassurance to international observers. Show us the concrete blocks, let us test them, prove that the radioactive materials are securely contained. This kind of verification is simply impossible once wastewater has been released into the Pacific's vast waters. So why did Japan reject these alternatives in favor of ocean discharge? The cynical but likely accurate answer involves cost and convenience. Ocean disposal is by far the cheapest and simplest option from an operational standpoint. The infrastructure requirements are minimal. Primarily just the pipes and pumps needed to move water from storage tanks to the sea. Ongoing costs are similarly modest. Deep underground storage or cement solidification would cost exponentially more and create more complex logistics. From a narrow accounting perspective focused solely on TEPCO's balance sheet and the Japanese government's budget, ocean discharge makes ruthless economic sense. But this calculation ignores externalized costs, the economic devastation to Japan's fishing industry, the degradation of Japan's international reputation, the potential long-term health impacts on populations throughout the Pacific region. When these broader consequences are factored in, the economic calculus looks very different. Japan chose the path that prioritized short-term corporate cost savings over environmental protection and international cooperation. That choice is now extracting a heavy price. If there were any hope that Japan might reconsider its approach, recent developments have effectively extinguished it. Not only has Tokyo continued with the wastewater release program, it has dramatically accelerated the pace. As of August 2024, Japan has completed 8 separate discharge cycles. The cumulative volume of contaminated water released into the Pacific Ocean now stands at approximately 54,600 tons. That represents a 70% increase compared to the previous year's discharge levels. Let that sink in for a moment. Not only is Japan continuing the policy that triggered international condemnation and economic sanctions, it's actually doing more of it. faster. Each discharge cycle releases thousands of tons of water containing residual radioactive materials into marine environments that sustain billions of people. Each release compounds the bioaccumulation already occurring in Pacific fish populations. Each release pushes the ecosystem further from its pre-disaster baseline. This acceleration sends an unmistakable signal about Japan's priorities and calculations. Tokyo has evidently concluded that the economic costs of storing and properly treating the wastewater exceed the costs of international criticism and lost seafood exports. It's a brutally pragmatic assessment that values engineering convenience over environmental stewardship. For China and other nations concerned about food safety and marine ecosystem health, this acceleration virtually guarantees that import bans will remain in place for the foreseeable future. How can Beijing justify lifting restrictions when the source of contamination is not only continuing but intensifying?